Hey guys, tonight we dive into a mystery that's been lingering for millennia, the Nephilim. Picture this ancient giants born of angels and humans, with their towering frames casting shadows over both sacred texts and forgotten myths. They were once part of a story so strange and spine-chilling that it still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to explore it. And let's face it, you probably won't survive this journey without a few goosebumps along the way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop a comment with your location and local time? I always find it fascinating to see where people are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Nephilim. If you've ever stumbled upon the book of Genesis, you've probably encountered the mysterious reference to the sons of God and the daughters of men. It's one of those biblical moments that leaves more questions than answers. And at the center of it all, the Nephilim, a race of giants, beings of otherworldly power, so impressive they'd become a legend for millennia. But who exactly were they, and where did they come from? The question has long perplexed theologians, historians, and even conspiracy theorists. Were they the offspring of angels and human women, as some interpretations suggest, or were they an entirely different kind of entity altogether? The Bible doesn't provide much clarity. In fact, it leaves us with more of a cryptic whisper than a definitive answer, one that invites speculation rather than resolution. Some claim the Nephilim were simply fallen angels, divine beings, who chose to defy their heavenly orders, descending to earth and siring giants with human women. Others, however, argue the Nephilim might have been something far less supernatural, perhaps ancient kings, warriors, or even creatures from a distant age. Historians still argue whether these giants were literal beings or symbolic representations of human corruption and divine judgment. Regardless of how we choose to interpret them, the Nephilim have become more than just a footnote in a dusty old manuscript. They've slipped into popular culture, folklore, and even paranormal circles, fueling our collective imagination. Think about it, giants, bloodlines of ancient gods and beings, capable of unimaginable feats of strength. No wonder they've held our attention. But to understand how the Nephilim became such a powerful symbol, we need to rewind the clock and dig into the origins of their story. Genesis 6:4 in particular is the starting point, describing these giants as the mighty men of old men of renown. You can almost hear the faint echoes of their footsteps as the passage hints at their immense stature and power. And while that's the foundation, it's the details, or lack thereof, that make this tale so endlessly fascinating. What were the sons of God doing coming down to earth and mingling with human women? Some say they were angels, while others suggest they were descendants of Seth, the righteous son of Adam. The vagueness surrounding their true identity only serves to deepen the mystery. Were these divine beings acting with good intentions, or was their intervention part of a grander, darker plan? Historians still argue over the implications of this strange union. We'll get into the potential explanations in just a bit. But first, let's consider the idea that these Nephilim weren't simply legends. They might have been real giants, part of an ancient race that vanished long ago. If they were real, it would mean they weren't just figments of religious lore. They could have had a direct impact on the history of humankind, shaping events, cultures, and even the natural world in ways we're still trying to understand. One thing's for certain, the Nephilim were born from a collision of the divine and the mortal. And this collision would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic moments in human history, the flood. As we continue our journey through the ancient echoes of the Nephilim, let's step back in time. Imagine the world long before cities, when myths were born, not from books, but from stories whispered around firelight. Here in this raw, untamed world, the Nephilim beings of both human and divine origins walked the earth. Were they giants in the literal sense, or was their greatness metaphorical, a representation of human ambition and divine fury? Let's dig deeper into the myths that stretch beyond the pages of the Bible. In many ancient cultures, there are stories of giants, beings of extraordinary size and strength, who once roamed the earth. Greek mythology is rich with tales of such beings, like the Titans, colossal gods, who ruled before the Olympian gods rose to power. Similarly, in Norse mythology, giants or Jotnar were often seen as primordial beings locked in an eternal struggle against the gods. But what's particularly fascinating is how these giants appear across various cultures, sometimes with striking similarities to the Nephilim. Were these stories of giants inspired by the same beings? Could they have been a global reflection of the Nephilim, making their presence felt far beyond the Middle East? Historians still argue whether these shared tales are simply coincidences or evidence of a shared cultural memory. In the ancient Hebrew world, the Nephilim were described as the mighty men of old, a phrase that invokes the image of a heroic age long past. These beings were said to be the progeny of divine beings, and human women emerging of the heavenly and the earthly. While the Nephilim in Genesis 6 are often thought of as giants, we don't have a detailed description of their actual size. Some scholars propose that the term Nephilim could have referred to warriors of great renown, not necessarily literal giants, but the idea that these beings were larger-than-life figures physically towering over ordinary humans has persisted throughout history. What if we're missing something? The size of the Nephilim may not have been their defining trait after all. Perhaps their influence was far more subtle, less about their physical stature and more about their extraordinary deeds that shaped the civilizations they interacted with. As some legends go, the Nephilim were not only physically powerful but possessed immense knowledge too. This was the kind of knowledge that could bring entire empires to their knees or set them on paths to greatness. Historians and anthropologists still debate whether the physical gigantism was part of the Nephilim's true nature. Was there a race of ancient humans with exaggerated features? Did they possess an unusual genetic makeup that made them appear larger than life? The records are unclear, and the problem is compounded by the way history has folded into myth. To this day, no conclusive evidence has been found to confirm or deny the existence of such a race. Whether they were beings of divine parentage or simply rulers and warriors who became mythologized over time, the Nephilim remain an enigmatic piece of the puzzle of ancient human history. In other parts of the world, we see similar myths of great beings who were said to have come from the heavens or had gods as ancestors. In South America, the legends of the giant gods and heroes of the Andes closely resemble the tales of the Nephilim. In the Polynesian islands, giants were thought to have inhabited the earth in ancient times, playing a role in shaping the landscape. The parallels across cultures raise the possibility that the Nephilim weren't just a localized story from ancient Israel, but a recurring theme in the collective consciousness of humanity. One quirky tidbit to consider: in some cultures, the giants were not seen as villainous figures, but rather as creators or protectors of humanity. In Greek mythology, for instance, the Titans weren't all bad. Some were seen as benefactors of humankind. Could the Nephilim too have been misunderstood in their time? Perhaps their interaction with humans wasn't as ominous as it first appeared. After all, the mere presence of powerful beings often inspires fear, but it can also stir awe. Were the Nephilim gods kings or guardians? Historians still argue whether they were protectors or harbingers of doom. Despite the differing interpretations, the idea of the Nephilim as giants, whether physical or metaphorical, continues to capture our imagination. Their legacy is not just embedded in ancient texts, but in our ongoing quest to understand where we come from and what might lie ahead. Let's take a closer look at the passage in Genesis 6 that sparked all the intrigue. It's one of those biblical moments that's cryptic enough to keep everyone guessing. The passage reads, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." This line, brief and enigmatic, has fueled centuries of debate. But what does it actually mean? Who were the sons of God? And why did they find human women so irresistible? Let's see if we can unravel this mystery. The term sons of God has been the subject of intense scholarly debate for centuries. In some traditions, these sons are interpreted as angels, heavenly beings who descended to earth and took human wives. In others, they're seen as descendants of Adam's righteous son, Seth. The idea that angels could engage in relationships with humans might sound strange, even impossible, but there's a long history of such interpretations, especially in early Jewish texts. Some suggest that the sons of God were not literally angels, but powerful rulers or kings chosen by God to uphold his will, who sought to expand their power by marrying into the human population. This theory fits with the idea that the Nephilim weren't just supernatural giants, but also powerful earthly rulers. Historians still argue whether the sons of God were divine beings or simply human elites. Then there's the question of why. Why did these beings choose to take human wives in the first place? Some ancient Jewish interpretations, such as those found in the Book of Enoch, suggest that the angels, or sons of God, were drawn to human women because of their beauty, leading them to abandon their divine realm and engage in forbidden relationships. The resulting offspring were the Nephilim giants, who embodied both the divine and the human. This idea is thrilling but unsettling, as it casts the Nephilim as the product of heavenly rebellion, potentially setting the stage for the catastrophic events that would follow. But hold on, there's another interpretation of the sons of God that is less supernatural and more down to earth. Some scholars argue that the term refers to the descendants of Seth, those who remained faithful to God, who intermarried with the daughters of men, the descendants of Cain, who were seen as fallen. In this view, the Nephilim were simply a group of mighty humans, warriors, and kings who were the result of these intermarriages. The idea of giants could then be metaphorical, representing these humans' exaggerated status and deeds. Historians still argue whether the Nephilim were indeed the offspring of divine beings, or whether their existence was the result of natural human conflict, power struggles, and the merging of different lineages. Let's take a moment to consider one of the stranger aspects of this story, the supposed consequences of these unions. In many ancient cultures, marriages between gods and mortals were believed to result in great, often tragic consequences. In Greek mythology, such unions produced figures like Hercules, heroes with godlike abilities who walked the line between mortal and divine. In the Bible, however, the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men weren't exactly celebrated. Instead, their existence seems to have been a factor in humanity's eventual downfall, contributing to the wickedness that would lead to the flood. In the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim's actions were so corrupting that they led to the destruction of the world. This darker interpretation feeds into the apocalyptic narrative where the Nephilim, these unnatural beings, are a sign of humanity's moral decay. There's also an eerie resonance between these biblical giants and other figures in myth who represent the fall from grace, the rebellion of angels, the sin of mortals. Could the Nephilim be a warning, a reflection of how unchecked ambition and the blurring of divine and human lines lead to catastrophe? Historians still argue whether these figures were the harbingers of doom or merely victims of an age-old myth of moral fallibility. One quirky tidbit here. Despite the weight of these ancient myths, there's a certain charm in how the Nephilim have been embraced by modern culture. From movies to video games, the idea of ancient giants has morphed into something of a pop culture phenomenon. The Nephilim aren't just supernatural beings, they've become symbols of our fears and fantasies. Whether they're giant warriors or fallen angels, their story resonates with the idea that humanity has always feared the blurring of lines between the divine and the mortal. But is this just our modern take on ancient myth? Or do the Nephilim still hold something deeper, something we haven't fully understood? As we move deeper into this ancient tale, it's important to remember the ambiguity of the sons of God. Were they angels, humans, or something else entirely? What we do know is that their actions created a ripple effect that would eventually alter the course of human history, triggering the judgment of a world that had gone too far astray. As we continue, let's focus on one of the most mysterious and captivating figures in the Nephilim story, the Watchers. Who were these beings, and why are they so intricately linked with the Nephilim? In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are described as angels tasked with watching over humanity. But things didn't go according to plan. These celestial beings, drawn by the beauty of human women, defied their heavenly duties and descended to earth, ultimately playing a pivotal role in the creation of the Nephilim. Let's unpack this complicated relationship between the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the divine order. In the traditional biblical account, the Watchers aren't explicitly mentioned in Genesis 6. However, they play a major role in the apocryphal Book of Enoch, where they are depicted as angels who, instead of simply observing humanity, begin to intervene in human affairs. These angels, said to be led by a figure named Azazel, took human wives and imparted forbidden knowledge to their offspring. This knowledge wasn't just mundane or earthly. It was knowledge that had the potential to change the very fabric of the human experience. The Watchers taught humanity the arts of warfare, metalworking, cosmetics, and even astrology. In a sense, they were the bearers of civilization's early technologies, but at a terrible cost. It's no surprise that the heavenly powers were furious. According to the Book of Enoch, God wasn't pleased with the Watchers' behavior, especially because their actions violated the natural order of things. These angels weren't supposed to interfere with human lives in such a personal way. But once they descended and began sharing this forbidden knowledge, the consequences were disastrous. Their offspring, the Nephilim, grew to be giants who were both physically imposing and dangerously skilled. They didn't just tower over humans. They were said to be warriors of great strength, capable of destruction on a scale humanity had never known. Historians still argue whether the Watchers were a metaphor for rogue angels or whether they represent an earlier interpretation of divine beings who were seen as fallible and capable of mistakes. Let's take a moment to consider one of the most fascinating elements of this tale, the knowledge the Watchers shared with humanity. This wasn't just the knowledge of metallurgy or weapon making, but also the arcane and the mystical. The teachings of the Watchers were said to have been so powerful that they triggered a chain of events that led to the corruption of mankind. The Nephilim, the offspring of these angels, were no longer just giants in the traditional sense. They became symbols of what happens when humanity reaches too far beyond its grasp. These beings, imbued with otherworldly power, came to represent humanity's fall into sin, a fall that would eventually lead to the cleansing flood. One particularly strange aspect of the Watchers' story is their punishment. Once the damage was done and the Nephilim had grown too powerful, the divine order intervened. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers were bound and cast into the abyss, imprisoned for eternity, as punishment for their rebellion. The story of their fall echoes many other religious narratives of divine punishment for those who overstepped their bounds. The angels, once entrusted with the care of humanity, had fallen from grace just as many gods in mythologies worldwide have done. The fall of the Watchers, much like the fall of Lucifer, serves as a cautionary tale. about the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of defying divine will. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the Watchers' descent to Earth has been immortalized in ancient texts, their story hasn't always been told the same way. In some versions of the myth, the Watchers' role was softened, and their knowledge-sharing wasn't viewed as a negative event. Instead, these beings were sometimes considered to be the first teachers of humanity, paving the way for civilization and contributing to mankind's rise. Historians still argue whether these figures were true rebels, as the Book of Enoch suggests, or misunderstood guardians who were punished unjustly. What's important to remember is that the Watchers weren't just passive observers. They played a crucial role in the creation of the Nephilim, and through their actions they brought about the rapid descent into chaos that would necessitate the Great Flood. By taking human wives and giving birth to the Nephilim, they disrupted the natural order, and the result was an earth filled with corruption, violence, and an unnatural blending of the divine and mortal worlds. This leads us to a larger question. How do the actions of the Watchers relate to the flood itself? Were the Watchers' defiance and the rise of the Nephilim the primary catalysts for divine judgment? Could the world have reached a point of no return where the corruption was so deep that a catastrophic event like the flood was the only solution? Historians still argue whether the flood was an act of mercy, cleansing a world that had fallen into chaos, or a harsh final judgment against a corrupt civilization that had overstepped its bounds. Either way, the story of the Watchers serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of forbidden knowledge and the consequences of divine rebellion. These angels tasked with protecting humanity instead played a role in its fall, leading us to the ultimate reckoning that was the flood. Now that we've laid the groundwork on the origins of the Nephilim and their celestial parentage, we must confront the cataclysmic event that would end their reign, the Great Flood. This massive deluge, which wiped out nearly all of humanity, was not only a divine act of judgment, but also a direct response to the moral decay that had been fueled by the Nephilim and their Watcher parents. The flood was God's attempt to cleanse the earth, but what exactly was he trying to cleanse it from? Was the flood a final act of mercy for a doomed world, or the harshest form of judgment humanity had ever known? Let's take a deep dive into the flood and its consequences, considering both the spiritual and physical aspects of this divine cleansing. The story of the flood begins with an unsettling observation. The wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This statement from Genesis paints a grim picture of the pre-flood world, one filled with corruption, violence, and moral decay. According to the text, the Nephilim were part of this chaos. They weren't just monstrous giants, they were symbols of human sin gone too far. Their birth, which was the result of divine beings defying heavenly orders, signified the collapse of the natural order. The offspring of these celestial human unions contributed to a world where human sin ran rampant and the balance of creation had been thrown into chaos. The flood then was not just a random event, it was a calculated response to the moral and spiritual rot that had taken root. But was the flood simply a form of judgment, or was it an act of mercy? There are arguments to be made for both interpretations. On one hand, the flood can be seen as an act of divine wrath, God cleansing the earth by wiping out those who had corrupted it. However, on the other hand, it also served as a way to preserve the righteous. Noah and his family, the only survivors of the flood, were chosen because they were seen as blameless in their generation. In this sense, the flood was not just about judgment. It was about the opportunity for a fresh start, a chance for humanity to rebuild in the wake of the destruction. Was this an act of mercy for Noah and his descendants, giving them the chance to repopulate the earth and rebuild. After the devastation, historians still argue whether the flood was purely an act of divine judgment or also an opportunity for redemption. Let's pause for a quirky thought. In many cultures around the world, there are stories of a great flood, often with a lone survivor or a chosen family. This suggests that the idea of a global cleansing or reset isn't unique to the Bible. Civilizations from the Mesopotamians to the Mayans all seem to share a common flood myth, some of which involve divine beings or gods sending the flood to cleanse the earth of corruption. The similarities between these stories and the biblical account of Noah's flood make some scholars wonder whether these ancient myths might be rooted in a shared human memory of an actual global flood event. Historians still argue whether these stories are purely symbolic or if they reflect real ancient events that were later mythologized. So why the Nephilim? Why was their existence tied to the coming of the flood? According to the Genesis narrative, it wasn't just the Nephilim's physical might that led to God's judgment. It was their very nature. They were part of a larger story of divine rebellion, where the sacred boundaries between the divine and human were crossed. The flood wasn't just about erasing the Nephilim. It was about restoring the proper order of creation. The Nephilim were an anomaly, a distortion of God's design, and their presence was a sign that humanity had crossed a dangerous line. Interestingly, the flood doesn't mark the end of the Nephilim story. In some interpretations, the Nephilim spirits continued to haunt the earth, lingering in the shadows and influencing human events. The Book of Enoch even suggests that the souls of the Nephilim became restless spirits, referred to as evil spirits, who would plague humanity for generations to come. These spirits were believed to cause trouble and corruption long after the physical giants had perished in the flood. This connection between the Nephilim and lingering evil spirits has persisted throughout folklore and popular culture. In some traditions, these spirits are seen as a source of demonic activity, continuing to sow chaos in the world long after their earthly counterparts were gone. Historians still argue whether the Nephilim's posthumous influence is purely mythological or if it points to a deeper spiritual significance. The flood, with its promise of destruction and renewal, became the pivotal event in the Nephilim narrative. It was a divine reset button, one that was meant to cleanse the world from the contamination of these hybrid beings and their corrupting influence. But in the aftermath, the story of the Nephilim didn't end. If anything, their legacy continued to haunt humanity, manifesting in spiritual and cultural ways for centuries to come. In the end, the flood was not just about wiping out the Nephilim. It was about restoring balance, offering a second chance for humanity, and purging the world of the consequences of divine rebellion. But whether the flood truly washed away the stain of the Nephilim, or whether their spirits lingered in the hearts of men, is a question that remains shrouded in mystery. After the floodwaters receded, the world was in theory wiped clean, a fresh start for humanity. But while Noah and his descendants began to repopulate the earth, the shadow of the Nephilim and their legacy continued to loom large. Though the giants themselves were drowned, their influence seemed far from gone. Their mythos didn't end with the flood. Rather, it began to take on a life of its own, seeping into folklore, religious traditions, and even conspiracy theories. As the centuries passed, the Nephilim became an integral part of humanity's collective imagination. Even in the wake of the flood, references to giants continued to crop up in ancient texts. The Bible itself is filled with mentions of giants in later passages, often tied to Israel's enemies. In the Book of Numbers, the spies sent to explore the land of Canaan report seeing giants living there, descendants of the Nephilim. The giants of Canaan were said to be so large and powerful that the Israelites saw themselves as mere grasshoppers in comparison. While these giants may not have been literal descendants of the Nephilim, Their mention suggests that the legacy of these ancient giants persisted in the cultural consciousness of the Israelites. Could it be that the Nephilim didn't simply vanish after the flood? Perhaps they left a lasting imprint on the generations that followed, not only through their physical size, but through the continued tales of their terror and might. Historians still argue whether these later giants, like the Anakim or the Rephaim, were part of the same mythological tradition or whether they were separate later creations. Was there a direct link between the Nephilim and these later giants, or were they just a continuation of a broader myth of powerful beings? The ambiguity of these references is what fuels modern speculation. Some researchers even suggest that stories of giants in Canaan could have been inspired by real large humans who lived during these ancient times, perhaps members of a warrior caste, or tall, imposing rulers who became mythologized over time. But the Nephilim didn't just live on in religious and cultural texts. In the modern era, they have become a focal point for conspiracy theories and paranormal research. Some believe that the Nephilim are still with us today, hidden in plain sight or influencing world events from the shadows. These ideas often revolve around the notion of a new world order, a global conspiracy theory that suggests secret elites, sometimes described as ancient bloodlines, are working to establish total control over the world. In these theories, the Nephilim are sometimes presented as a metaphor for a group of powerful otherworldly beings manipulating the course of history. The idea of the Nephilim surviving and influencing the world from behind the scenes has captivated the imaginations of many, creating an entire subculture of believers in the supernatural. This connection between the Nephilim and modern conspiracy theories is, of course, speculative. Still, it speaks to a deep-seated fear and fascination with the idea that ancient powers, perhaps even divine ones, still hold sway over our lives. The idea that there are ancient bloodlines connected to the Nephilim has been particularly popular in some circles, with figures like the Illuminati and other secret societies being tied to these ancient giants. But is there any truth to these claims? Historians still argue whether these modern-day interpretations of the Nephilim are rooted in ancient myth or whether they are simply an extension of our current cultural anxieties about power and control. On a more academic front, the Nephilim have continued to spark debates among scholars and theologians. Some argue that the Nephilim were simply a reflection of the fears and anxieties of ancient people, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. Others suggest that they were real physical giants who once roamed the earth. The question of whether the Nephilim were symbolic or real continues to divide experts, and yet the fascination with them persists. Why do these beings continue to haunt us? Why have they endured for thousands of years, crossing cultural boundaries and blending with other mythologies? One thing is certain: the Nephilim's legacy has transcended their initial role in the Genesis narrative. They have become symbols of both divine wrath and human ambition, representing a blurred line between the heavenly and the earthly. Whether seen as literal giants or metaphorical warnings, the Nephilim continue to capture our collective imagination. Their story is no longer just a tale from the Bible. It has evolved into something much larger, spreading across the world in ways that few other ancient myths have. The Nephilim are a reminder that our understanding of history is always evolving, shaped by both ancient beliefs and modern reinterpretations. But it doesn't end here. The Nephilim story isn't just something to read about in dusty old texts or obscure conspiracy forums. Their legacy has implications that stretch far beyond ancient history and popular culture. Some believe the Nephilim might even have a role to play in the future, particularly when it comes to prophecies about the end of the world. As we step into the realm of prophecy, the Nephilim take on a new and even more ominous role. These ancient beings who were once confined to myth and legend have become central figures in modern-day predictions about the end times. Across religious texts, apocalyptic visions, and contemporary theories, there is an overwhelming sense that the Nephilim will return either literally or symbolically to usher in the final judgment. But what exactly does the prophecy say, and how does the idea of the Nephilim fit into these terrifying visions of the world's end? The idea of the Nephilim returning is particularly prominent in some interpretations of biblical prophecy. Many believe that the return of these giants, or the reemergence of their spiritual descendants, will coincide with the apocalypse, a time of global conflict and divine reckoning. The book of Revelation, with its vivid imagery of beasts, angels, and battles, provides fertile ground for those who argue that the Nephilim will play a pivotal role in the unfolding of the end times. In some readings, the sons of God from Genesis 6 are seen as precursors to the rise of a new breed of giants, beings that will return to Earth, wreaking havoc in the final days. The connection between the Nephilim and prophecy isn't just limited to Christian eschatology. In other religious traditions, there are also predictions of supernatural beings returning in the last days. In Islam, for example, there is a belief in a final confrontation between the forces of good and evil, with angels and demonic entities playing a major role. Some Islamic scholars have suggested that the Nephilim might be linked to the creatures that will fight in the final battle between light and darkness. These apocalyptic images span cultures, suggesting that humanity's fear of the Nephilim isn't just a religious quirk, but a common thread in global mythology. But it's not just ancient texts that fuel the modern prophecy of the Nephilim's return. There are conspiracy theorists who claim that the Nephilim are already making their way back to Earth. These theories often center on the idea of a new world order, a powerful secretive group that supposedly controls the fate of humanity. According to these theories, the Nephilim are linked to these shadowy figures who are either their descendants or are themselves some form of hybrid beings with supernatural abilities. The return of the Nephilim in these accounts represents the final stages of global domination, whether it's through the rise of genetically engineered superhumans or the return of ancient bloodlines. The concept of the Nephilim's return fuels fear of a world on the brink of chaos and total control. Historians still argue whether these theories are based on genuine interpretations of prophecy or simply modern fears projected onto ancient myths. This connection between the Nephilim and the end times has even found its way into popular culture. In books, movies, and television shows, the Nephilim have become key players in apocalyptic narratives, from the giant angelic beings in Supernatural to the Nephilim-inspired characters in The Mortal Instruments. The idea of a half-human, half-divine race that will one day return to shape the fate of humanity is a common trope. These depictions often play on the fear that we are not in control of our own destiny and that ancient, powerful forces may one day reclaim the earth. But in these stories, the Nephilim are never just mere spectators. They are active participants in the battle between good and evil, often portrayed as having godlike powers, yet struggling with their own inner demons. It's this duality, the Nephilim, as both divine beings and fallen creatures, that makes them such compelling characters in the context of the end times. The Nephilim's return, whether in fiction or in prophecy, serves as a symbol of the battle between light and darkness, purity and corruption, and the unresolvable tension between the mortal and the divine. One quirky tidbit to consider: some have speculated that the Nephilim's return might not be physical at all. Instead, it could be spiritual or metaphysical. Perhaps the Nephilim are not destined to return as towering giants, but as spiritual entities that will possess and manipulate humanity. This idea has led to a wide range of conspiracy theories about the hybridization of humans with supernatural beings, suggesting that we are on the verge of a new era of angelic or demonic influence. But once again, historians and theologians still debate whether this is just an elaborate projection of modern anxieties or a deeper spiritual truth embedded in the ancient myth of the Nephilim. As unsettling as it is, the return of the Nephilim has a strong hold on the imagination of those who see the end of the world as more than just an event, but a spiritual and cosmic battle that will determine the future of humanity. Their role in these apocalyptic visions suggests that, for all their ancient mystery, the Nephilim are far from being forgotten relics of a distant past. They have evolved into symbols of our deepest fears tied to a future that is both inevitable and perhaps unknowable. As the prophecy of the Nephilim's return intertwines with visions of the end of days, it leads us to a larger and even more intriguing concept: the final judgment. In the biblical narrative, this moment represents the ultimate reckoning, where all of humanity will stand before God to be judged for their deeds. The return of the Nephilim is often seen as a key event that will signal the beginning of this judgment. But what exactly does the final judgment entail, and how does the concept of the Nephilim fit into it? Let's explore the dramatic scene of humanity's last reckoning, and the role that divine beings, both angels and demons, may play in this climactic moment. The final judgment, as described in the book of Revelation, is a terrifying and awe-inspiring event. It involves the arrival of Christ on earth, the binding of Satan, and the resurrection of the dead. The righteous will be rewarded with eternal life, while the wicked will face eternal damnation. For many, this judgment is seen as a culmination of all human history, an event where every action, every sin, and every good deed is weighed and assessed. But beyond the human actors involved in this judgment, there's also a strong spiritual component. Angels and demons play key roles in this apocalyptic drama, representing the forces of good and evil that will clash one final time. The Nephilim, as beings that represent both divine and human, occupy an interesting place in this scenario. If they were indeed the offspring of fallen angels and human women, they exist in a liminal space, neither fully divine nor fully human. In some interpretations, this hybrid nature makes them powerful agents of the judgment to come. The idea is that the Nephilim, in their return, would be part of a celestial army, either fighting for or against the forces of good. Their mixed heritage makes them both symbols of the rebellion against divine order and agents of the chaos that will accompany the end times. But not all scholars agree on the Nephilim's role in the final judgment. Some view them not as active participants, but as symbols of the corruption that leads to judgment in the first place. If the Nephilim were once the product of forbidden unions between angels and humans, their very existence represents a crossing of boundaries, a defiance of divine law. In this view, the Nephilim serve as a warning about the dangers of overstepping the natural order, a theme that will be reflected in the final judgment. Historians still argue whether the Nephilim will physically return to Earth during the final judgment, or if they are simply symbolic of the larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. In the Christian tradition, angels play a particularly important role in the judgment. According to Revelation, angels will be the ones to separate the righteous from the wicked, casting those who are damned into the lake of fire. These angels, messengers of God's will, are often depicted as warriors, instruments of divine justice. In many ways, they mirror the roles of the Watchers, those same angels who once descended to earth and mingled with human women. Could the angels of the final judgment be the same divine beings who once contributed to the rise of the Nephilim? The connection between the Watchers and the angelic forces of the apocalypse raises interesting questions about redemption and punishment, as well as the idea of celestial beings being involved in both the fall of humanity and its ultimate salvation. Meanwhile, demons, fallen angels who sided with Satan, are seen as the antagonists in the final act. They will be bound, judged, and cast into the abyss alongside Satan. The Nephilim, as the offspring of angels and humans, are often linked to demonic forces in certain eschatological interpretations. In these views, the return of the Nephilim is not just about the reemergence of giants, but about the full unleashing of supernatural evil. They are seen as demonic beings that will help bring about the final battle, serving as instruments of chaos in a world already on the brink of destruction. The role of demons in the final judgment is one of total defeat, and the Nephilim, as products of rebellion against God, would have to face their own reckoning in the end. One quirky tidbit here: the idea of angels and demons battling for the fate of humanity is not exclusive to Christianity. Similar themes are present in other cultures, such as in Zoroastrianism, where the forces of light and darkness are constantly at war. In these traditions, the final judgment is seen as the ultimate victory of good over evil, where the corrupt are destroyed and the righteous are saved. The image of angels and demons waging a celestial war is a theme that transcends religious boundaries and has found its way into literature, film, and other forms of popular culture. From epic fantasy novels to blockbuster movies, the celestial war between angels and demons is a recurring motif that often mirrors the apocalyptic showdown of the final judgment. Whether the Nephilim will physically return or remain symbols of humanity's fall, their connection to the final judgment is clear. These beings, born from a defiance of the divine order, represent everything that went wrong in the world. Their return, if it were to happen, would signal that humanity is once again on the brink of destruction, that the lines between the mortal and the divine have blurred once more. And in that final moment, the Nephilim's legacy will be judged, as will all of creation. The final judgment represents the ultimate reckoning, not just for humanity, but for the entire cosmos. It's a time where divine justice will finally prevail, and all beings, whether human, angelic, or even Nephilim, will face the consequences of their actions. With the final judgment looming as the ultimate cosmic reckoning, it's impossible to ignore the supernatural forces at play. As we've seen, the Nephilim, born from the union of angels and humans, exist at the intersection of both divine and demonic realms. And while they may be some of the most fascinating figures in apocalyptic prophecies, they are not alone in the celestial drama that will unfold during the end times. Angels and demons, the fundamental opposites in spiritual warfare, will take center stage as they engage in the final battle that will determine the fate of humanity. Let's explore the roles these divine and demonic forces will play in the ultimate showdown and what it means for the world's future. At the heart of many apocalyptic prophecies is the idea of a great spiritual battle. Angels, the messengers and warriors of God, will fight against demons, the rebellious fallen beings who sided with Lucifer. This celestial conflict, first hinted at in the book of Revelation, will reach its peak during the final judgment, where the forces of good and evil collide in a confrontation that will reshape the world. The Nephilim, in some interpretations, are often seen as the physical embodiment of this battle. As beings who represent both divine and human nature, they symbolize the ultimate struggle between good and evil. The role of angels in the final showdown is clear. As God's warriors, they will be tasked with carrying out the judgment. According to Revelation, angels will separate the righteous from the wicked and deliver God's justice. They will unleash plagues, battle demonic forces, and ensure that God's will is executed on earth. These angels will also play a key role in the ultimate defeat of Satan, who will be bound and cast into the abyss. In many ways, the angels of the final judgment are the exact opposite of the fallen watchers, those angels who once defied God's will by coming to earth and mingling with human women. In a sense, the angels of the apocalypse are tasked with righting the wrongs that the watchers committed long ago bringing about the final redemption of the world and restoring the natural order. On the other side of the battlefield, demons led by Satan will fight desperately to retain control over humanity. These malevolent beings are the ones who have corrupted humanity throughout history, whispering lies and sowing chaos. In Christian theology, demons are the fallen angels who followed Lucifer in his rebellion against God. Their goal in the end times is to lead humanity astray, turning people away from the divine and into the clutches of evil. The Nephilim, with their rebellious origins, could be seen as the ultimate manifestation of this demonic influence. If the Nephilim do return, they would be part of Satan's army, continuing the ancient battle against God's divine order. In many ways, the war between angels and demons mirrors the broader struggle between good and evil that has existed throughout history. The Nephilim's presence on earth, their very existence, has always been a symbol of the dangers of crossing the line between the mortal and the divine. They represent the consequences of rebellion, of defying the natural order of creation. And in the final battle, these hybrid beings, whether literal or symbolic, will serve as the dark agents of the forces that seek to undo God's creation. The angels, meanwhile, will be tasked with restoring balance and bringing about the ultimate triumph of good over evil. One quirky tidbit here: the theme of celestial warfare isn't limited to Christianity. The concept of angels and demons locked in an eternal battle is present in many mythologies around the world. In Zoroastrianism, for instance, the forces of good, Ahura Mazda, and his divine spirits battle against the evil spirits, the Devas. Similarly, in Islam, the concept of a final confrontation between good and evil plays a major role in the Day of Judgment, with angels recording human deeds and demons trying to lead humanity astray. This universal theme speaks to humanity's deep-seated fear of the forces of darkness and our hope for divine intervention to restore order. What's truly fascinating is how this ancient imagery has influenced modern apocalyptic stories. In films, books, and television shows, the idea of angels and demons fighting for the fate of the world has become a central motif. Whether in Constantine's Supernatural or The Exorcist, the battle between divine and demonic forces is a recurring theme that reflects our ongoing struggle with good and evil. The Nephilim, as supernatural beings that straddle both sides of this cosmic divide, are a perfect embodiment of this conflict. Whether in fiction or in the prophetic texts, they represent the blurred line between light and darkness, human and divine. At the end of the day, however, it's the victory of divine justice that will define the final judgment. While the Nephilim and their demonic allies may fight to the bitter end, the angels will carry out God's will, ensuring that the righteous are saved and the wicked are cast down. The final battle will be the culmination of everything that has come before it, a cosmic showdown where the forces of good and evil are judged, and the world is either redeemed or condemned. The Nephilim, as creatures of both divine descent and human corruption, will face their own reckoning as part of this judgment. The role of the Nephilim in the ultimate battle remains uncertain. Will they return as agents of chaos, working alongside the forces of evil, or will they be symbols of the human tendency to rebel against divine order, reminding us of the consequences of defying the natural world? One thing is clear: the Nephilim are inextricably tied to the forces of good and evil, and their role in the final judgment will shape the future of the world. Now let's take a step back and consider the grand picture. The Nephilim, once feared and revered as giants with celestial parentage, are central not only to the stories of old, but to the very essence of what it means to grapple with the divine, the human, and the supernatural. These beings, born of rebellion and forbidden unions, have left an indelible mark on the human imagination, influencing everything from ancient mythologies to modern-day conspiracy theories. But as the apocalyptic visions unfold, the Nephilim's role is more than a mere fascination with ancient giants. Their presence, whether literal or symbolic, has become a lens through which we view the ultimate fate of humanity, the cosmos, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. If we accept the notion that the Nephilim's return signals the beginning of the end, we're left to ponder what that truly means for us. Are we on the brink of a spiritual and cosmic awakening, one in which humanity is called to account for its deeds throughout history? Or is the return of the Nephilim merely a mythological interpretation of our deepest fears about power control? And the unknown historians and theologians continue to debate whether the Nephilim will physically return to Earth, or if their return represents a more abstract spiritual crisis. But in either case, their story serves as a profound reminder of the dangers of crossing the line between mortal and divine, of defying the natural order in pursuit of power, and of the destructive consequences that follow. One of the most compelling aspects of the Nephilim's tale is how their legacy is interwoven with the human experience. Whether they are seen as literal giants or symbolic figures, the Nephilim remind us of our constant struggle with the forces of good and evil. They are a reflection of our own fears, ambitions, and desires to transcend our mortal limitations. And in that sense, they serve as both a warning and a symbol of hope. For in their story lies a timeless message that no matter how far humanity reaches beyond its grasp, no matter how much we flirt with the divine, there are always consequences. And when we push too far, when we forget the natural order, we may find ourselves facing the ultimate judgment. But beyond the fear and darkness that surrounds the Nephilim, there is also the possibility of redemption. The story of the Nephilim, like the story of humanity itself, is not just about descent and fall, but about the potential for renewal. After all, the flood, as destructive as it was, also marked a fresh start for the world. The Nephilim, for all their rebellion, were not beyond redemption. They were, in a sense, a consequence of human failure, the product of divine beings who chose to rebel. But in the ultimate judgment, there remains the possibility of restoration, even for those who have gone astray. Could the Nephilim's return mark a new chapter of redemption for the world? A final chance to reconcile the forces of good and evil. This potential for renewal is especially poignant when we consider the role of faith in the context of the final judgment. In many religious traditions, the judgment is not merely about punishment, but about the opportunity to redeem what has been lost. Whether through grace, repentance, or divine mercy, there is always the possibility of salvation. And in the story of the Nephilim, the idea of redemption echoes through the very fabric of their existence. They were not meant to exist born of a divine rebellion that blurred the lines between heaven and earth. Yet even in their destruction, even in the flood that wiped them from the earth, there was the possibility of a new beginning. The Nephilim's legacy is not just about their fall, but about the chance for humanity to rise above its own mistakes and find a path back to balance and harmony with the divine. One final thought: the story of the Nephilim, these hybrid beings born of divine rebellion, reminds us of something deeply human. At the heart of their myth lies a tale of ambition, of desire to transcend limitations, and of the inevitable consequences of trying to play God. But in their return, or in their continued influence, there may also be a message of hope that even in the darkest corners of our history, even in our greatest failures, there lies the potential for something greater. The Nephilim, in all their terrifying mystery, may ultimately be symbols not of destruction, but of the eternal struggle for balance between the divine and the human, the celestial and the earthly. And in that struggle, perhaps, there is the possibility for redemption after all. So as we close tonight's journey, let's remember, the Nephilim's tale is not just a story from the past, but a reflection of our ongoing battle with the forces that shape our destiny. Whether giants, angels, demons, or something else entirely, their legacy challenges us to confront the delicate balance between good and evil and to question where we stand in this ancient and eternal struggle.